His parents abandoned him because he was born with Down syndrome. But what they never anticipated was that this boy's life would take a completely different turn. That made the mother live in torment and pain all her life. The sterile scent of antiseptic filled the air, mingling with the muted sounds of distant voices and medical equipment beeping rhythmically. Ashley gripped the edge of the hospital bed, her knuckles white against the crisp, clean sheets. Pain surged through her, sharp and relentless, but with each contraction, there was a flicker of hope. Today, she would finally meet the child she had carried for 9 long months. "Just a little longer," Daniel murmured, his voice a comforting balm against her rising anxiety. He sat beside her, his hand clasping hers tightly. His eyes, filled with excitement, shimmered in the overhead lights. "We're going to be parents." Ashley managed a weak smile, her breath hitching as another wave of pain crashed over her. "I can't wait to hold our baby," she gasped, focusing on the vision of their child, their miracle. With every contraction, her determination grew stronger, fueled by the anticipation of new life. But as the hours dragged on, the joy of impending motherhood began to blur with fear. The doctors were efficient, moving in and out of the room, their faces inscrutable. When the time finally came, and Ashley pushed with every ounce of strength she had, the world narrowed to the sound of her own heart pounding in her ears. And then a cry pierced the air, a sound so pure and beautiful that it momentarily dulled the pain. A nurse placed the baby in Ashley's arms, and for a brief moment, the world around them faded. "Look at him," Daniel breathed, his voice thick with emotion. But as Ashley gazed down at the small face swaddled in white, her heart sank. The baby's head was larger than normal, his eyes were wide and bulging, and he has only one ear, and Ashley's breath caught in her throat. "Is everything all right?" she asked, the dread pooling in her stomach. The nurses exchanged worried glances, and moments later a doctor entered, his expression grave. "We need to perform some tests," he said gently. "It's important to check for any genetic anomalies." Ashley's heart raced as the weight of those words settled in. Hours later, the results came in, and Ashley felt the room shift around her. The doctor's voice was calm, clinical, yet the words struck her like a blow. "Your son has Down syndrome." A heavy silence enveloped them. Ashley looked to Daniel for support, but his face twisted in disbelief and anger. "What do you mean?" Daniel's voice rose, sharp and accusatory. "This is your fault. You should have known." "Daniel, please," Ashley pleaded, tears streaming down her cheeks. "He's our son. He needs us." Daniel shook his head, stepping back as if the child were a contagion. "I can't do this. I won't. You've brought a defect into our lives." His words echoed through Ashley's mind, drowning her in a sea of despair. She had never imagined this moment would be tinged with so much pain. The elation of motherhood was overshadowed by a chasm of fear and shame. The days that followed were filled with a suffocating silence. Daniel grew distant, refusing to look at the baby or Ashley. He spent hours pacing the hospital hallway, muttering under his breath about the life they had lost. Each passing moment deepened the rift between them, transforming their home from a sanctuary into a battleground of unspoken grief and resentment. Ashley tried to bond with her son, holding him close, whispering promises of love, but her heart felt heavy with fear and uncertainty. What kind of life could they offer him? What would the world think? As the reality of their situation sank in, Ashley felt cornered by a whirlwind of emotions, guilt, sorrow, and the overwhelming weight of responsibility. She wanted to fight for her son, but Daniel's rejection loomed like a dark cloud, suffocating her spirit. One night, as she rocked the baby in her arms, tears slipped down her cheeks. The weight of her circumstances pressed heavily against her chest, and she was overcome by a sense of isolation. It was then she made the most agonizing decision of her life. In the early hours of the morning, with the world still shrouded in darkness, Ashley placed her sleeping son in the hospital crib, his small body wrapped tightly in the blankets. She brushed her fingers lightly across his forehead, a farewell tinged with heartbreak. "I'm so sorry," she whispered, the words barely escaping her lips. She turned and walked away, her heart shattering with each step. The echoes of her son's cries faded behind her, swallowed by the sterile walls of the hospital. As she slipped through the exit, the weight of her choice settled in a choice born from fear, an unending ache that would follow her like a shadow. She sat in the corner at the living room, her arms wrapped around herself, a feeble attempt to shield against the emptiness that had replaced the warmth of hope. Daniel hadn't returned home, not since the day she had fabricated the story that their son had died. It was the only way, she had told herself, the justification tasting bitter on her tongue. If only Daniel would come back, perhaps they could piece together the fragments of their shattered lives. But day after day, he drowned deeper in the bottle, a spectre of the man he once was. Ashley had glimpsed him once, stumbling through the hospital doors, eyes glazed, his stubble unkempt. When he saw her, his face twisted in a mixture of anger and sorrow, but he turned away, as if the mere sight of her reminded him of everything he wished to forget. She had called out to him, her voice shaky, "Daniel, please, we can fix this." But he merely staggered out, leaving her to face the reality of their broken family alone. The sterile walls of the hospital echoed with the quiet hum of machinery, and the soft beeping of monitors created a rhythm that filled the silence. In the neonatal unit, where fragile lives hung in the balance, Jesse lay in a small crib, surrounded by tubes and wires. His tiny body, barely larger than a doll, seemed too delicate for the world he had been born into. Every breath he took was a triumph, every beat of his heart a reminder of his will to survive. The nurses, day after day, tended to him with a care that went beyond professionalism. There was something about him, something fragile yet fierce, that stirred a deep sense of protectiveness in the staff. They called him Jesse, a name one of the nurses had given him, a name that meant gift of God. It seemed fitting, considering how he fought, how he defied the odds every day. He was a miracle in their eyes, a symbol of resilience in a place where life and death danced so closely together. As the days turned into weeks, the doctors marveled at Jesse's progress. His body, once so small and frail, was slowly gaining strength. He was still fragile, still vulnerable, but there was a light in him that refused to be extinguished. Every ounce he gained, every time his fingers curled around a nurse's hand, was a victory. Yet despite all the care, despite all the medical attention, there was a void in Jesse's life, a gap that no amount of treatment could fill. It was the absence of his mother's touch, the warmth of a parent's love. The hospital provided everything he needed to survive physically, but emotionally, he was adrift. Other babies in the ward cried out for their parents, and their calls were answered with the soft coos of mothers and fathers. But Jesse's crib remained silent. There were no visits, no tender whispers, only the constant whir of machines and the occasional murmur of nurses as they adjusted his blankets or checked his vitals. The contrast between the love and care the medical staff showered upon Jesse and the void left by his mother's absence was stark. The nurses took turns holding him, rocking him gently when their shifts allowed. They would sing to him softly, their voices low and soothing, trying to fill the empty space with whatever comfort they could offer. But they were not his family. They were not the ones he needed. Ashley, meanwhile, lived in a different kind of silence. Her home was cold, not because of the weather, but because of the chill that had settled between her and Daniel. He was gone, more often than not, drowning his pain in the bottom of a bottle, coming home late, staggering through the door, a shadow of the man he used to be. When he did speak, it was only to lash out, his words sharp and cutting, aimed to wound. Ashley couldn't escape the weight of what she had done. She had pushed Daniel away with her lies, but worse, she had abandoned her son. She had convinced herself that it was for the best, that it was the only way to hold on to Daniel. But now, Daniel was slipping through her fingers like sand. And Jessie. Jessie was nothing more than a memory she tried to forget. Weeks passed. In the hospital, the nurses continued their vigil over Jessie. They celebrated every milestone, every tiny achievement. But at night, when the ward grew quiet and the other babies lay cradled in their parents' arms, Jessie remained alone. His crib, though filled with blankets and toys left by the staff, was a symbol of abandonment. His tiny hand would reach out, grasping for something, for someone, but there was no one there to answer his call. Jessie's cries echoed through the room, a soft, plaintive sound. It was the cry of a child who, though too young to understand, felt the absence of the one thing he needed most, his mother's love. And though the nurses would rush to his side, would pick him up and cradle him in their arms, it wasn't the same. It never would be. An event that changed Jessie's life. Victoria sat in the nursery holding her newborn daughter, Vanessa, in her arms, her gaze fixed on the silent cradle swaying gently. Jessie, a fragile infant, lay there, swaddled in a pale blue blanket, his small face serene amidst the chaos surrounding him. Nurses hurried back and forth, attending to the needs of other newborns, their laughter and chatter contrasting sharply with the stillness of Jessie's world. She felt a tightening in her chest as she recalled the circumstances that had brought Jessie here abandoned and alone, a tragedy that had wrapped its cold fingers around his tiny life. It was a situation that no child should have to endure, and the thought sent waves of compassion washing over her. "Phillips," she called softly, breaking her reverie. Her husband stood just a few feet away, his brow furrowed in thought. "Look at him. He's so small, so innocent. He deserves a chance at a real family." Phillips sighed, rubbing the back of his neck as he turned to face her. "I know, Vic, but we don't even know what his situation is. There are risks involved." His voice held a note of hesitation tinged with concern. "We can offer him love. We can give him a home," Victoria insisted, her eyes shining with determination. "Just think of what he's been through. We can't let that continue. We have to do something." He looked down at Jessie, his heart softening as he watched the baby's tiny fingers curl instinctively. Phillips had always admired Victoria's boundless compassion. It was one of the things that had drawn him to her in the first place. And now, here she was, ready to extend their family to someone who had been cast aside. "Maybe we could at least visit him a bit longer?" he suggested, trying to keep his reservations at bay. "Get to know him better before making any decisions." Victoria nodded, a smile breaking through her anxious expression. "That's all I'm asking for. Just let me love him. We'll figure the rest out together." Over the following days, the couple made daily visits to the hospital. Each time they entered the nursery, they were met with the sight of Jessie nestled in his cradle. Victoria would coo softly, gently brushing her fingers against his tiny hand, watching him stir ever so slightly. Philip stood beside her, his heart gradually opening to the idea of adopting the child. As they continued their visits, they forged an unspoken bond with Jesse. They learned his little quirks, how he would scrunch his nose when he was hungry, or how his eyes would flutter open just when Victoria sang softly. Each moment spent with him felt like planting seeds of hope and love in a life that had been so harshly neglected. Victoria and Phillips quickly became familiar faces in the nursery, their laughter and warmth a welcome presence. Other parents, some struggling with their own situations, began to notice the couple's devotion to Jesse. It wasn't long before the nurses started mentioning how well the baby responded to their visits. "He's such a sweet little boy," one nurse said one afternoon as she handed Victoria a small, knitted hat for Jesse. "I can tell he's starting to recognize you two." Phillips smiled at Victoria, his heart swelling with newfound hope. The thought of being Jesse's family began to feel less like an impossibility and more like a promise waiting to be fulfilled. That evening, after their visit, they sat together in their living room, the air thick with anticipation. "You know," Victoria said, her voice thoughtful, "the paperwork for adoption takes time, but we can start the process. I've been looking into it." Phillips ran his fingers through his hair, his mind racing. "I want to be sure we're doing the right thing, Vic. Jesse deserves the best." "I know," she replied gently, her hand finding his, "and I believe we can give him that. He needs us." Silence enveloped them for a moment, both lost in their thoughts. Phillips took a deep breath, the weight of responsibility pressing on his shoulders. "Let's do it. Let's bring him home." Victoria's eyes sparkled with joy. "Really? You mean it?" "I do. Let's give him a family. Let's give him love." And so, as they embarked on the journey of adoption, they felt a sense of purpose fill their hearts. With each passing day, their commitment to Jesse deepened. He was no longer just a boy in a cradle. He was the child they had longed for, a beacon of hope in their lives. As they left the nursery that evening, Phillips glanced back at Jesse, a wave of emotion washing over him. This child, who had been left to face the world alone, would now have a family who would cherish him. The weight of their decision settled comfortably in their hearts, intertwined with dreams of a future filled with laughter, warmth, and unconditional love. Jesse was brought home by the Davidson family, stepping into a world far removed from the cold, sterile hospital where he had spent his first fragile months. The sprawling house welcomed him with open arms, its warmth and life filling the empty spaces where Jesse's earlier days of abandonment still echoed. Victoria Davidson, Jesse's adoptive mother, wasted no time in ensuring that every need of his was met with precision and care. She threw herself into his well-being as if she were making up for every moment the little boy had been left alone in that cold hospital crib. Specialists were called in, therapists arranged, no expense was spared. Jesse's special condition required more than the love that Victoria and her husband, Phillips, could give him. It required expertise, patience, and a fierce determination to help him thrive, even though the path ahead was uncertain. The family made sure Jesse's life would be full of comfort, love, and every opportunity. He was given the best soft blankets, soothing lights, and a peaceful room filled with toys that would never let him know a moment of neglect again. Victoria often stood by his crib at night watching him sleep. Every rise and fall of his chest was a reminder of how close she had come to never knowing him. "He's ours now," she whispered to Phillips one evening, her voice thick with the weight of her emotions. "We'll give him everything." Phillips quieter in his emotions, simply nodded. "He's already changed us," he replied, his hand resting on her shoulder. "And it's only the beginning." Days turned into weeks, and Jesse began to grow in a home brimming with love. The contrast between his life now and the one he had known was stark. He no longer knew the clinical touch of nurses who did their best, but could never offer the warmth of a mother's arms. Now, Jesse was enveloped in the unconditional love of a family that had chosen him, not out of obligation, but because they couldn't imagine life without him. The Davidsons made sure Jesse's arrival into their family would be recognized not just in their hearts, but in their community. Victoria, always fond of tradition and celebration, insisted on organizing a grand baptism for both Vanessa and Jesse. The event was to symbolize not only the cleansing and blessing of their two children, but also to formally introduce Jesse to the world as part of their family. This was no ordinary event. It was one that would capture attention far and wide. When the day of the baptism arrived, the Davidson estate was transformed into a scene of elegance and celebration. The press, always eager for a heart-warming story, had already caught wind of the event. After all, it wasn't every day that a prominent family like the Davidsons chose to adopt a child with Down syndrome. Jesse's story, already tragic in its beginnings, had taken a turn that many wanted to witness firsthand. As the cameras flashed, Victoria and Phillips stood proudly with their two children. They hugged Jesse and Vanessa in their arms. The ceremony was intimate, but the world was watching. Victoria spoke softly to Jesse as the priest approached with the holy water. "You are loved," she whispered, her voice barely audible above the quiet murmurs of the crowd. The moment the water touched Jesse's forehead, the air felt electric, like something significant had just happened. And in a way, it had. The world was being shown a glimpse of a second chance, a life once discarded now embraced, cherished, and given the opportunity to flourish. Photos of the baptism flooded the newspapers the next day, painting the Davidsons as saviors, heroes even. The headline of one major paper read, "Davidsons adopt miracle boy, a family's love transcends boundaries." But for Victoria, this wasn't about headlines or admiration. This was about Jesse, a boy who had needed her as much as she had needed him. The world might have seen the Davidsons as extraordinary, but in their quiet moments at home, when the cameras were gone, they were just a family who loved each other deeply and would stop at nothing to make sure Jesse and Vanessa were safe, loved, and prepared for whatever life would bring. 2 years had passed since Ashley's life took a dark turn. The days bled into one another, each moment a reminder of her choices. Daniel had moved on, leaving her behind for another woman, and the ache of his absence gnawed at her insides. As she wandered through the city, the bustling streets felt like a distant echo of a life she no longer recognized. The morning sun filtered through the sheer curtains of her small apartment, illuminating the dust motes that danced in the air. Ashley sat at her tiny kitchen table, her fingers tracing the rim of an empty coffee mug. She had spent too many mornings like this, staring into the void of her regrets. It was a mundane Tuesday when the newspaper caught her eye, folded on the counter where she had hastily tossed it the day before. As she unfolded the crinkled paper, the headline leaped out at her. "Local family celebrates baptism. A day of joy and reflection." Her breath hitched as she spotted the photograph. The Davidson family, their smiles bright and genuine, adorned the page. In the center of the picture stood a young boy, his short curls framing a face that was both familiar and foreign. He was holding a white cloth, a symbol of purity, innocence, a stark contrast to the turmoil within her heart. The boy was unmistakable, his appearance marred by the small absent ear. A chill swept through her, and for a moment the world around her faded into a blur. This was her son. The realization crashed over her like a wave, and she felt the weight of 2 years of loss and despair settle heavily on her chest. Panic surged as she recalled the moment she had let him go, the moment that had shattered her life. Her heart pounded in her ears as regret twisted like a knife in her gut. How could she have been so reckless, so selfish? The life of a child she had brought into the world now thrived in a family that was not hers, a family that she had abandoned him to. Determined, Ashley picked up her phone. The Davidson family deserved to know the truth, and she needed to make amends. She hesitated, fingers hovering over the screen, anxiety knotting her stomach. After several deep breaths, she dialed the number she had found online, each ring a reminder of how far she had fallen. When Phillips answered, the calmness in his voice did little to soothe her nerves. "Hello? Mr. Davidson?" Ashley stammered, gripping the phone tightly. "This is Ashley. Ashley Thompson. I'm Jesse's mother." There was a beat of silence on the other end, and she could almost hear the gears turning in his mind. "You shouldn't be calling here." "I need to explain," she urged, desperation creeping into her voice. "I know I made a mistake. I left him, but I want to see him. I've changed. Please, I just want to talk." Phillips's tone turned sharp, a protective edge slicing through her hope. "You left him, Ashley. You have no right to come back now. He's part of our family, and you're not welcome here." "Please," she pleaded, tears stinging her eyes. "I've thought about him every single day. I've regretted my choice. I can't live with myself knowing I abandoned him. I just want a chance to explain, to see him." "Your regrets mean nothing to me," Phillips snapped. "You forfeited that right when you walked away. Jesse deserves better than a mother who decided he wasn't worth her time. You need to leave us alone." The line went dead, and Ashley stood frozen, the finality of his words crashing over her. Anguish clawed at her throat as she sank to the floor, the cold tiles grounding her in the reality of her failure. In the days that followed, Ashley became consumed by the obsession of finding Jesse. Each attempt to reach out felt like a brick wall, each rejection a reminder of her sins. She haunted the edges of Davidson's neighborhood, a ghost of what might have been, desperate for a glimpse of the boy whose face haunted her dreams. Every child she saw reminded her of Jesse, of the life she had stolen from him. Regret morphed into an unbearable weight, and she knew she had to confront the truth of her past, no matter how painful. She had to find a way back to him, not just for herself, but for the son who had grown up without her. The journey ahead felt insurmountable, but the fire of determination ignited within her, driving her to seek forgiveness and, perhaps, a second chance. The midday sun filtered through the tall glass windows of Phillips's office, casting sharp shadows across the polished mahogany desk. Phillips leaned back in his chair, fingers steepled in contemplation. The serenity of the room was a stark contrast to the storm brewing within him. He could feel his anger simmering, a slow burn igniting as he awaited Ashley's arrival. The door swung open with a hesitant creak, and Ashley stepped in, her eyes darting around the room before landing on Phillips. There was a vulnerability in her posture, an uncharacteristic fragility that made Phillips's chest tighten with a mix of empathy and irritation. "Mr. Phillips," she began, her voice trembling slightly, "thank you for meeting me." "Cut to the chase, Ashley," he replied, his tone clipped. "I don't have all day." She inhaled deeply, steadying herself as if she were preparing to plunge into icy waters. I need to talk about Jesse. I want to be part of his life again. Phillips's expression hardened. You don't understand. Your presence would disrupt everything. Jesse is happy now, and that's what matters. Ashley's eyes glistened with unshed tears. But I'm his mother. I made mistakes, yes, but I've changed. I can be better for him. I can give him the love he deserves. The love you think you can give him? Phillips shot back, his voice rising. You've already shown him what your version of love looks like. Chaos, instability. You think a few heartfelt words will erase that? She flinched, her resolve wavering under the weight of his accusations. I'm begging you. Please, just give me a chance. Let me prove I can be there for him. Proving yourself won't change the past. Jesse has a family now, a stable one that he deserves. He leaned forward, eyes narrowing. If you attempt to disrupt that, I will take legal action. I won't let you jeopardize his happiness. Ashley's heart sank, the reality of her situation crashing over her like a wave. You can't do this. He needs me. I'm his mother. Mother? Philip scoffed. You abandoned him. You left him to fend for himself while you chased your own selfish desires. You think that entitles you to just walk back in and take over. The words hit her like a physical blow. I didn't abandon him. I was forced to make a choice, a terrible choice. She paused, desperation tinging her voice. I'm here now. I want to make things right. Victoria, who had been silently observing from the corner, finally spoke up, her voice gentle yet firm. Ashley, I sympathize with your pain, but Phillips is right. Jesse's well-being must come first. You can't expect us to allow you back into his life without considering the impact it might have. Ashley turned to Victoria, searching her face for any sign of compassion. You understand what it's like to lose someone you love. How can you stand by and watch me suffer like this? Victoria's gaze softened momentarily, but she remained resolute. It's not about suffering, Ashley. It's about what's best for Jesse. You have to understand that your attempts to make amends might do more harm than good. The realization struck Ashley like a cold slap. She was fighting a battle she couldn't win. The family she had lost wasn't just gone. It was replaced by another, by people who had given Jesse the love she had failed to provide. Is this how it ends? She whispered, her voice cracking. I lose him forever? Not because he died, but because someone else stepped in? Phillips's expression softened for just a moment, revealing the strain of his own conflict, but he quickly hardened again, the protector instinct taking precedence. You need to let him go, Ashley. It's the only way you'll find peace. Focus on healing yourself. Ashley felt the world around her tilt, her knees almost buckling beneath her. I didn't think it would be like this. I thought you'd understand, that you'd see I'm different now. People change, Phillips acknowledged, but his eyes were steely. But that doesn't mean you have the right to alter someone else's life for your own needs. With that, Ashley knew the conversation was over. She'd come in with hope, but it had been dashed against the reality of her choices. As she turned to leave, the gravity of her loss settled on her shoulders like a heavy cloak. She was not just losing Jesse. She was losing the possibility of ever having him back. In the silence that followed her departure, Phillips glanced at Victoria, who looked troubled, yet resolute. Do you think she'll ever come to terms with it? He asked quietly. She has to, Victoria replied, her voice barely above a whisper. For her sake, and for Jesse's. And as the door closed behind Ashley, the weight of her decision lingered in the air, a haunting reminder of love lost and the painful road ahead. Ashley had always been a strong woman, but strength can be brittle when weighed down by guilt and grief. The loss of her child and the breakdown of her relationship with Daniel had sent her spiraling into a darkness she couldn't escape. The sharp edges of regret cut into her every thought, replaying the decision she made over and over until it became unbearable. Each day felt heavier than the last, the world around her dimming as her emotions swallowed her whole. Her thoughts became chaotic, fragmented. She began wandering through the city, eyes unfocused, feet dragging, as if searching for something she'd never find. The once vibrant streets of the town she'd lived in her entire life now felt foreign. Storefronts, cars, even the faces of the people she passed felt like distant memories of people who lived in a world she no longer belonged to. Her mind was lost somewhere in the past, replaying those final moments with Daniel, the echo of his words, the weight of her own silence. One night, she wandered farther than usual. The streetlights flickered above her, casting long shadows on the empty sidewalks. Her hands were shaking, and her chest felt tight, like the walls of her mind were closing in. She stumbled, catching herself against the side of a building, her breath coming in shallow gasps. It was then that someone noticed her, a stranger who had been watching from across the street. Concern in their eyes, they approached, gently asking if she was okay. Ashley couldn't answer. Her lips moved, but no words came out. She wanted to scream, to explain everything, but all that came was silence. The stranger called for help, and within the hour, Ashley found herself in the back of an ambulance, the city fading away as they drove her to a place she never thought she'd end up at, a mental health institution. The quiet of the facility was a stark contrast to the chaos in her mind. She sat in her room, staring at the white walls, the hum of the air conditioner, the only sound breaking the silence. Here, there was no running away from her past, no distractions. She was left alone with her thoughts, her guilt, her loss. And it was here, in this sterile, clinical environment, that she would spend the rest of her days, reliving the mistakes she could never undo. Meanwhile, Jesse, her son, now 3 years old, was living a life so different from the one Ashley had imagined. He was a bright and joyful child, always quick with a smile and a laugh. The Davidson had given him everything Ashley had hoped for, but could no longer provide a stable home, love and security. Yet, even in his young age, there were signs that Jesse struggled. While he was a sweet and affectionate boy, his emotions were hard for him to control. Some days he would be the sunshine in the room, lighting up everyone around him with his infectious energy. But other days, he'd become overwhelmed, small frustrations blowing up into tantrums that left him exhausted and confused. His new parents worried about him, wondering if the trauma from his early years, the instability, had left deeper scars than they could see. Jesse had moments where his anxiety would flare up, small, quiet moments that seemed to come from nowhere. His little hands would ball into fists, his breaths would become rapid, and his eyes would fill with confusion. His adoptive parents tried their best to soothe him, to give him the tools he needed to cope, but they couldn't shake the feeling that there was something more, something deep within him, tied to the life he no longer remembered but somehow still felt. Despite these challenges, Jesse was resilient. His optimism and joyful nature kept him moving forward, bouncing back from the tough moments with a strength that even adults might envy. He was growing, learning, and navigating a world full of love, even though the shadow of his past lingered just beyond his reach. Jesse sat on the edge of his bed, a mess of sheets and stuffed animals surrounding him like the comforting chaos of childhood. Sunlight poured through the window, illuminating his small room, which was adorned with posters of classical composers and bright stickers. He was humming softly to himself, a tune he had learned just the day before, his fingers instinctively tapping a rhythm on the mattress. "Jessie, honey, are you ready?" Victoria's voice floated in from the hallway, warm and melodic. "Almost, Mom," he called back, his voice high and cheerful. As he rushed to the piano in the corner of the room, Jessie glanced at his reflection in the window. His brown hair was tousled, and his glasses slid down the bridge of his nose. He pushed them up and sat on the stool, placing his fingers on the keys. The notes spilled out, clear and crisp, filling the room with a gentle symphony. Victoria appeared at the door, her heart swelling with pride. She watched him for a moment, mesmerized by how effortlessly Jessie lost himself in music. To her, it was nothing short of magic. "You sound amazing, sweetheart," she exclaimed, stepping inside. "Thanks, Mom. I'm working on that song you like." Jessie's eyes sparkled with excitement. "Can I play it for you later?" "Of course," Victoria replied, moving closer. She knelt beside him, brushing a stray hair from his forehead. "You've been practicing so much. Your dad and I are so proud of you." Jessie beamed, his face lighting up at her words. "I want to play at the concert next month. Do you think I can?" "Absolutely," she said, her voice steady. "You just keep practicing like this. You've got a gift, Jessie." Jessie nodded, determined, but, in the back of his mind, a shadow flickered, a thought he couldn't quite grasp. He had seen the way his friends at school sometimes hesitated, their eyes clouding with confusion when they talked about family. They would mention siblings and parents who shared similar traits, laughter echoing in their stories. Jessie didn't understand it fully, but sometimes a small part of him wondered if he belonged in the same way. "Jessie, time for breakfast," Phillips called from downstairs. "Coming!" Jessie jumped up, his heart racing at the thought of his favorite pancakes. He hurried down the stairs, the smell of warm syrup and fresh coffee filling the air. At the kitchen table, Phillips was flipping pancakes while Vanessa, his older sister, set the table. She glanced up, her eyes sparkling with mischief. "If you keep practicing that much, you'll be playing at Carnegie Hall in no time." "Maybe," Jessie laughed, his voice bubbling with joy. As they sat together, the conversation flowed easily. Phillips shared a funny story about his work, and Vanessa chimed in with her own hilarious interpretations. Victoria listened, her heart swelling at the laughter that filled the room, grateful for the life they had built together. After breakfast, Jessie returned to his piano, the sunlight now casting warm patterns across the keys. He played, losing himself in the music, his fingers dancing effortlessly. Each note felt like a release, a connection to something beyond himself, and he savored the feeling of freedom it brought. Days turned into weeks, and Jessie thrived. Victoria and Phillips were diligent in nurturing his talent, enrolling him in music classes, and encouraging him to perform for family and friends. Every concert felt like a celebration, a testament to the love that enveloped him. His passion for music grew deeper, as did his bond with his family, who celebrated each of his achievements with pride. But while Jessie flourished in his cocoon of love, a part of him remained blissfully unaware of the tumultuous history that had shaped his very existence. He couldn't remember the stories whispered in hushed tones between his parents, the painful truths that lingered in the shadows. As he played on, the world outside continued in its chaos, but inside the Davidson household, Jessie thrived, a testament to the transformative power of unconditional love. The days in the psychiatric hospital passed like a blur for Ashley. At first, she resisted the reality that she had lost her son, not just physically, but emotionally. Spiritually, every bond that once tied them together had been severed the moment she walked away. Jesse was gone, and he wasn't coming back. Ashley could still see his face, the softness of his features when he was just a baby, the innocence that she had abandoned in her moment of weakness and fear. It was this face that haunted her in the stillness of the night, and for the longest time she couldn't escape it. But slowly, as the days bled into weeks and the weeks stretched into months, something began to change. The numbness in her chest started to thaw, and with that thaw came acceptance. It wasn't immediate, and it wasn't without its battles. There were nights when she cried herself to sleep, clutching the thin sheets of the hospital bed, wishing desperately to go back in time and rewrite the story that had gone so horribly wrong. But over time, the tears became less frequent, the agony less sharp. She began to accept the truth. She had lost Jesse, but Jesse had not lost his life. Meanwhile, out in the world beyond those sterile hospital walls, Jesse had grown into a man. The years had shaped him into something extraordinary, something that Ashley, in her darkest moments, could never have imagined. With the unwavering support of the Davidson family, Jesse had flourished. His hands, once small and fragile, had become strong and graceful, moving effortlessly over the piano keys. He had discovered his gift early, a deep, resonant love for music that echoed through every fiber of his being. The Davidsons, ever patient and loving, had nurtured this passion. They provided him with the best teachers, the finest instruments, and most importantly, the belief that he could achieve greatness despite the challenges that came with his condition. Jesse's journey was not without struggle, of course. There were moments of doubt, times when the world felt too harsh, too loud, too unkind for someone like him. But he persevered, drawing strength from the love that surrounded him, from the family that never once made him feel less than whole. Now, at 21, Jesse had become a renowned pianist, his performances drawing crowds that were moved by the emotion and purity of his music. Each note he played carried with it the story of his life, the abandonment, the adoption, the love, and the resilience. He didn't know much about his birth mother, only fragments of stories whispered in hushed tones. The Davidsons had never hidden the truth from him, but they had also ensured that his life was not defined by it. Jesse wasn't a victim of his past. He was a survivor. As Ashley sat by the window of the hospital, staring out at the horizon, she thought of Jesse often. She didn't know all the details of his life now, only the occasional updates that filtered through in the form of letters from social workers or the rare magazine article she stumbled upon. But she knew he was doing well. She knew he had found happiness in a way she never could. And that, in some small way, brought her peace. The Davidson family remained strong, their lives a testament to the power of unconditional love and acceptance. They had raised Jesse with the belief that no matter where you come from, no matter what challenges you face, you can still find joy, purpose, and fulfillment. As the past faded into a distant memory, their future was bright, full of promise and hope. For Ashley, the realization that Jesse had found a life filled with love and success allowed her to let go. It didn't erase the pain or the regret, but it softened it, turned it into something more manageable. In the end, Jesse had become a symbol not just of the consequences of abandonment, but of the incredible power of second chances. His life, despite its rocky start, was proof that love could heal even the deepest wounds. And as Ashley closed her eyes, she finally felt ready to let the past rest. Thank you all for sticking with us until the end of the video. The story of Jesse was truly an emotional journey, wasn't it? It's a powerful reminder that no matter how harsh life gets, love and perseverance can turn pain into something beautiful. Jesse not only overcame his heartbreaking past, but he also grew into a great artist, loved and cherished by the Davidson family. If this story touched your heart, don't forget to hit like and subscribe so you don't miss any of our upcoming videos. I'd love to hear your thoughts, so share them in the comments below. Remember, any one of us can rise above our past and build a better future, as long as we don't give up hope. See you in the next video, and have an amazing day.